Welcome to the Stellar Vault. Say hi in the comments to awaken the archive. Then like, subscribe, and let the tale begin.
Tomas Bruckner moved low along the railbed, keeping to the shadow line where the container stacks blocked the morning light. His boots crunched on gravel. Every step sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The rail yard was a graveyard of steel. No lights, no generators, no traffic. Everything had stopped at once. Tomas Bruckner had watched it happen. 6:47 a.m., coffee mid-brew. And then, the world went dead. They were cold now. Locomotives sat dead on their tracks. Cargo containers stood open and abandoned, their contents half-loaded, the cranes that served them frozen mid-swing. No hum of generators, no distant rumble of highway traffic, just wind moving through the scaffolding of the corridor, whistling between factory stacks that had not gone cold in 40 years. He had been walking for 2 hours, maybe 3. Hard to tell without a phone, without a watch that worked. His digital Casio had died with everything else. Nobody panicked at first. Power outages happened. But then the phones were dead too. All of them. And the battery-powered radio in the foreman's office gave nothing but silence across every frequency. That was when the panic started. Tomas did not panic. He had spent 9 years in combat engineering before he got out and took the millwright job. He knew what a coordinated systems failure meant. It meant someone had done it on purpose. And if someone had the power to kill every electronic system simultaneously, then standing around waiting for answers was a good way to die. So he walked. He had a backpack with water, a pry bar, a flashlight that did not work, and a folding knife. He had his hands. He had his brain. That would have to be enough. The sound reached him before the sight did. A low rhythmic tone, like a tuning fork struck inside a metal drum. It pulsed in sets of 3. Steady, mechanical, coming from the main freight lane between the container stacks. Tomas dropped to a crouch behind a coupling joint and looked. 6 figures moved through the rail yard in perfect formation. 2 forward, 2 flanking, 2 trailing, spacing exact, movement synchronized. They were tall, 7 feet at least, maybe closer to 8. Lean-limbed, with smooth skin that caught the gray light in a way that looked wrong. Too clean, too even. Faint lines ran across their bodies in patterns that pulsed with a soft blue-white glow, steady as a heartbeat. They carried devices in their 4-fingered hands, not rifles, something sleeker, shaped for precision. They swept these instruments left and right as they walked, scanning. The pulsing tone came from a small unit mounted on the lead figure's torso. They moved like they owned the ground beneath them. Tomas watched their eyes, wide-set, dark. The pupils were horizontal slits, like a goat's. They tracked in smooth mechanical sweeps, left to right to left. No urgency, no tension in their bodies. Their bioluminescent patterns pulsed slow and even. Calm. These things were calm. He had seen that kind of calm before, not in soldiers, in administrators, in people who showed up after the fight was over to process the paperwork. They were not here to fight. They were here to manage. Which meant whoever sent them believed there was nothing left to fight. Tomas stayed frozen until the patrol passed. He counted their steps, measured their spacing, watched how they turned, watched what they scanned and what they ignored. They swept their instruments at chest height, looking for signals, frequencies, electronic emissions. They were not looking down. They were not checking corners. They were not watching the shadows where a man with a pry bar could reach them in 3 steps. He filed that away and kept moving. The foundry was a cathedral of rust, 3 stories of blackened iron framework, dead furnaces, and conveyor systems locked in place. It sat at the heart of the corridor's industrial spine, surrounded by pipeworks and storage buildings connected by a maze of service tunnels that ran under the factory floor. Tomas found them on the second level. 11 people huddled around a workbench lit by a single kerosene lamp someone had pulled from a maintenance locker. 5 factory workers still in their coveralls. A logistics driver. 2 men from the welding shop, one of them bleeding from a gash above his ear. A kid, maybe 17, wearing a fast food uniform and a look that said he had not blinked in hours. A woman from the admin building who had not spoken since it started. And Dahl, Sergeant First Class, retired, if the faded tattoo on his forearm was accurate. Mid-60s, built like a door frame that had settled, but not weakened. He sat on an overturned crate near the lamp, cleaning his fingernails with a box cutter, and his eyes were the steadiest thing in the room. Nobody was in charge. That was clear. They had found each other the same way water finds a drain. Downhill, toward the nearest cover. Tomas set his pack down. 6 of them came through the east freight lane 20 minutes ago. Formation patrol, scanning for electronics. We saw a group 2, one of the welders said. 8, moving along the access road past the chemical plant. Armed? Carrying something. Could not tell what. Dahl looked up from his fingernails. I've been here since it started. I counted 4 patrols from this window. 6 per group. Same formation every time. Same speed. Same route spacing. He folded the box cutter. They are running a grid. Standard occupation sweep. But light. Real light. How light? Tomas asked. No vehicles. No air support. No heavy weapons visible. 6-unit foot patrols with scanning equipment and sidearms. Dahl's voice was flat. The voice of a man reading a parts list. They came expecting nothing. Silence. The kerosene lamp hissed. The kid in the fast food uniform spoke. What are they? Does it matter? Tomas said. They killed the power. All of it. Everywhere. All at once. They have ground troops running grid patrols. That is not a rescue operation. That is a lockdown. So, what do we do? The logistics driver asked. Dahl looked at Tomas. Not because Tomas was in charge, because Tomas was the only other person in the room whose hands were not shaking. They are scanning for signals, Tomas said. They are not scanning for people. Their patrols are light, no armor, no support. They move in a fixed pattern. He paused, and they are walking through places where they cannot see more than 30 feet in any direction. Dahl smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. The rail tunnel, Dahl said. South Junction. Runs under the freight depot. Single track. No room to maneuver. They would have to pass through in a column. Tomas looked at the welders. What do you have? Cutting torches. Fuel for maybe 40 minutes of burn. Chain, bolt gun, sledge. Anything that makes a spark without electricity. We are welders. Everything we own makes a spark. Tomas nodded. He looked at the group. 11 people. 5 with useful skills. The rest with functioning legs and hands. Nobody has to come, he said. But if they are running a grid, one of those patrols is going to sweep this building within hours. This lamp. The smell of kerosene. 11 warm bodies in a dead factory. Their scanners may be tuned to electronics, but they have eyes. He let that settle. I would rather meet them in that tunnel than wait for them to find us here. The tunnel was perfect. 100 meters of reinforced concrete, single rail track, wide enough for a freight car and nothing else. No lighting, no ventilation shafts large enough to matter. One way in, one way out. They set it up in 20 minutes. The welders cut a section of heavy chain into 2 lengths and strung them across the tunnel at neck height for a veth, 3 feet from each end. In the dark, they were invisible. Tomas positioned 4 of the factory workers at the far entrance with the sledge, the pry bar, and sections of pipe stripped from the tunnel's drainage system. Dahl took the bolt gun and placed himself in a recessed service alcove halfway through the tunnel. The kid, who said his name was Elko and nothing else, crouched behind Dahl with the welding torch, tank strapped to his back, hands steady for the first time since Tomas had seen him. The others waited outside. If this went wrong, they would run. That was the only plan for them. They waited. It did not take long. The rhythmic scanning tone entered the south end of the tunnel like a heartbeat. Pulse, 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 steady. The same calm frequency Tomas had heard in the rail yard. The point pair entered first. They had to stoop slightly in the tunnel. Their bioluminescent patterns cast faint moving light on the concrete walls, turning the tunnel into something that looked almost alive. Their scanning instruments swept forward, finding nothing. No signals. No electronic activity. The first one hit the chain at the throat. The impact was not dramatic. A sudden stop. A wet, choking sound. The scanning tone stuttered. The second one in the point pair stumbled into the first. Behind them, the formation compressed. Dahl fired the bolt gun. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, a flat pneumatic crack that hit the walls and came back doubled. The bolt took the third Vth in the column through the side of the head. It dropped without a sound. Then the tunnel became a slaughterhouse. The welders hit the cutting torch. A blue-white lance of flame erupted in the darkness, 4,000 degrees of focused heat in a space where nobody could dodge. The nearest Veth screamed. The sound was nothing like a human scream, higher, oscillating. It set teeth on edge and rattled the fillings in Thomas's jaw. He came out of the dark with the pry bar and hit the nearest one across the knee joint. It buckled. He hit it again. And again. The bioluminescent patterns on its skin were going haywire, flickering in rapid, chaotic bursts. Fear. That was what fear looked like on them. The factory workers charged from the far end. Pipe sections and the sledgehammer. No technique. No precision. Just violence in a concrete box where superior technology meant nothing because there was no room to aim, no time to think, no system to call for help. It lasted less than a minute. 6 creatures lay on the tunnel floor. 2 were still making sounds. Dahl used the bolt gun twice more. Then there were no sounds. Tomas leaned against the tunnel wall. His hands were shaking. The pry bar was slick. He could taste copper in the air. Not blood, something else. Whatever they had inside them, it was not blood, and it smelled like scorched ozone. 2 of his people were down. One of the factory workers had taken a blast at close range. His left arm was gone from the elbow down, cauterized instantly by the energy discharge. He was alive but in shock, staring at the stump with the blank fascination of a man whose brain had not caught up with reality. The second was the logistics driver. A piece of shattered scanning equipment had opened his throat. He was already dead. Dahl was stripping a sidearm from the nearest body. He turned it over in his hands, studied the grip. The trigger mechanism was different. Pressure-based, maybe. He pointed it at the far wall and squeezed. Nothing happened. "Biometric," he said. "Lock to their hands." He tossed it back on the body. But the chain held. The bolt gun worked. The torch worked. Pipes and hammers and darkness worked. They gathered what they could carry. Physical objects. Pieces of armor plating that might stop something. Sections of the scanning equipment that might be useful later for reasons they did not yet understand. They left the bodies where they fell. Elko had not spoken during the entire fight. He stood near the tunnel entrance, welding torch still in his grip, the flame out. His fast food uniform was spattered with something iridescent. "You all right?" Tomas asked. Elko looked at him. The shaking was gone. "Where is the next one?" Elko asked. Somewhere above them, Rael Tovin reviewed the sector display aboard the command node and felt nothing resembling concern. The orbital suppression had been flawless. Planetary-scale electromagnetic neutralization, executed in a single synchronized pulse. Every human system dependent on electronic function had ceased simultaneously. Power generation, communication networks, weapons platforms, transportation, data infrastructure. All of it. Silent. The transition index rated at 0.97, the highest efficiency score the Ascendancy had recorded across 13 subjugations. Tovin's duty was simple: manage the ground survey, confirm systemic collapse, log population density patterns for the settlement teams arriving in the next cycle. 40,000 Veth ground personnel across the planet's major industrial and population centers. Standard deployment, standard timeline. He reviewed Patrol Unit 7's positional data. Their tracking signal had updated normally until a short time ago. Then it stopped. Tovin checked the communications log. No distress marker, no weapons discharge alert, no anomaly flag from their scanning array. The unit simply ceased transmitting. He pulled the environmental data for their last known position: an underground rail structure, concrete, ferrous metal, dense material interference. Signal attenuation was expected in such environments. He reclassified the event as a communication disruption caused by structural density and flagged it for follow-up at the next patrol rotation. Standard procedure. His bioluminescent patterns held steady, slow, even, the calm pulse of a being in complete control of a situation that required no urgency. He opened the next sector file. Across the corridor, in the dead foundry where the kerosene lamp still hissed against the dark, 11 people had become 9. 9 people with the knowledge that the things walking their streets could bleed. 9 people who were not on any system, not on any scan, not in any file. Tovin would not learn about them from his display. He would learn about them the way every Veth in the corridor was about to learn. Too late. Rael Tovin stared at the sector display and counted the gaps. 3 patrols gone from the grid in the same sector within a single rotation. No distress signals. No weapons discharge logs. No biometric alerts indicating physical compromise. Their tracking signatures simply stopped, one after another, like lights going out down a hallway. The display showed green across every metric. Human electronic activity. None. Human communications. None. Weapon signatures. None. Atmospheric threat index. Negligible. The system was telling him everything was fine. Tovin opened a formal request to Regional Overseer Kale Drennis for authorization to increase patrol density in the affected subsector. He composed it carefully. Signal attenuation due to structural interference. Possible equipment malfunction across multiple units. Recommendation for reinforced survey teams to confirm ground conditions. He did not write what he was actually thinking. He was not sure what he was actually thinking. There was no framework for it. He submitted the request and waited. Authorization required confirmation through the Regional Overseer, cross-reference with the Fleet Threshold's operational index, and approval from the Tactical Standards Division. This was proper. This was how the Ascendancy maintained coherence across every subjugation it had ever conducted. No single commander acted on impulse. The system worked because the system was followed. Tovin sat in the blue glow of his display and waited for the system to work. His skin patterns flickered. Brief. A single irregular pulse across the circuit lines on his forearms. He pressed his four-fingered hand flat against the console and steadied himself. Anomaly. Not crisis. Anomaly. He pulled again the environmental data for the last known positions of all 3 units. Dense structural zones, concrete, ferrous metal, rail infrastructure, underground corridors, all environments known to attenuate signal transmission, all environments where communication dropout had been documented on previous worlds. The explanation was right there, clean, logical, supported by precedent. Tovin accepted it because the alternative was something his training had never prepared him to consider. Elsewhere, far beyond the reach of Tovin's systems, Fenhaltak had been moving since the silence started. He lived out past the edge of the corridor, in a country where people still split wood for heat, hunted what they ate, and treated a cell phone as something you charged once a week and forgot on the kitchen counter. When every screen and engine and light bulb died at the same moment, his first thought was not panic. It was annoyance. The power company had been getting worse for years. Then he stepped outside and saw the sky. Something was up there. Not clouds, not aircraft. Something vast and slow that caught the light in patterns that shifted with a deliberation that was either mechanical or alive. He stood on his porch and watched it for a long time. The wind moved through the trees and nothing else moved at all. No cars on the road, no planes overhead, no hum from the power lines that ran along the ridge. He went back inside, loaded the crossbow, took the hatchet off the wall and the roll of steel wire from the garage workbench, filled a pack with water, jerky, and a first aid kit that was mostly tape and gauze. Then he started walking toward the corridor. That was where the population was dense. That was where the factories and the infrastructure sat. And if something had come down from whatever was hanging in the sky, that was where it would go first. Not out here, where there was nothing to control. In there, where the people were stacked tight and dependent on systems that no longer worked. He picked up others along the way. A farrier named Gross, who carried a short-handled sledge and had forearms that looked like they had been forged rather than grown. Two brothers from a construction outfit, Mac and Oren, who brought a nail gun, a crowbar, and the kind of flat-eyed composure that said they had already made their decision about what came next and were at peace with it. Nobody talked much. They moved through dead suburbs where people stood in their yards staring at the sky or sat on porches with the blank patience of those waiting for someone to tell them what had happened. Fen did not stop to explain. He did not know enough to explain. He just knew that walking toward the problem was better than sitting with it. The corridor announced itself before they reached it. Factory stacks rising against a gray sky like the bones of something massive and dead. Rail lines converging from every direction. Warehouses the size of cathedral naves, their loading doors hanging open, their interiors dark and silent. They found the answer in a drainage channel beneath the freight depot. Bodies. Tall, gray-white, stripped of equipment. The faint circuit patterns on their skin had gone dark, but the shapes were still visible beneath the surface, like veins in a dead leaf. Scorch marks on the concrete walls. Bolt holes, clean and deep, punched through what Fen assumed were skulls. The air smelled like burned ozone and something mineral that sat on the back of the tongue and would not leave. Fen crouched beside the nearest body. He studied the four-fingered hands, the smooth, almost jointless plating on the torso and limbs, the wide-set eyes with their horizontal pupils, still open, still dark, still holding whatever the last thing they saw had been. "Someone did this with hand tools," Gross said. He was reading the damage the way a farrier reads a horse's gait. Blunt trauma, thermal burns, penetration wounds from something pneumatic, everything at close range. No gunfire, no explosives, just craft. Fen looked down the length of the drainage channel, scoring on the walls where chains had been anchored, marks on the floor where bodies had been dragged. Whoever had done this had set their ground, funneled the enemy in and taken them apart in the dark, with whatever they had in their hands. Mac picked up a piece of shattered equipment from the floor. Alien. The material was lighter than it looked, with a surface that felt like ceramic, and metal had been married at a level too fine to see. He turned it over and set it down. "So someone is out there," Mac said, "fighting these things, with bolt guns and torches." Fen stood. He looked at the bodies on the floor. He looked at the three men standing with him. Then he looked deeper into the corridor, where the factory stacks rose in rows that blocked the sky and turned the streets between them into canyons of concrete and rust. "Then we are in the right place," he said. They moved into the corridor's heart, like water finding the cracks in a foundation. Quiet. Steady. Watching everything. Thomas Bruckner had learned 3 things about killing the Veth. Darkness was everything. Their scanning instruments were calibrated for electromagnetic emissions, not visible light. In full darkness, with no active electronics, a human being was invisible to their equipment. But the Veth carried their own betrayal on their skin. Those bioluminescent patterns, the steady, calm pulse that marked them as ascendancy personnel in good standing, turned every patrol into a procession of lanterns in the pitch black. They announced themselves to anything with functioning eyes long before their scanners could register a threat that had no signal to give. Close quarters negated every advantage they possessed. The Veth sidearms were precise instruments designed for engagement at distance. In a space where contact happened at arm's length, where a human body could close the gap in a single stride, precision was irrelevant. Mass was what mattered. Speed. The willingness to swing a length of pipe at something taller than you and keep swinging until it stopped moving. The Veth were tall, but light-framed, built for endurance and fine manipulation rather than impact. A factory worker with a sledge in a corridor too narrow to dodge was a problem no amount of superior technology could solve. They could not adapt in the field. Every patrol Tomas hit responded the same way. The point pair halted. The formation compressed. They attempted to establish scanning contact with their sector command node. Those few seconds of procedural response, where training overrode instinct and protocol overrode survival, were the window. The same window, every single time. They died reaching for their system because their system was all they knew. The group had hit more patrols since the tunnel. A team in a warehouse loading bay where the ceiling was low enough that the Veth had to stoop and the humans did not. Another in the basement corridors of an old chemical plant, where the hallways turned at sharp angles and the darkness was absolute. Same principles, different killing floors, chains for the first contact, the bolt gun for the follow-up, the torch for the chaos, pipes and hammers and hands for the rest. They were getting better at it, learning the craft of it the way you learn any trade, through repetition and the unforgiving feedback of mistakes. Elko had stripped armor plating from the dead and figured out how to bind sections to a forearm using wire and electrical tape, turning alien engineering into a crude shield that would not stop a direct sidearm blast, but could deflect a glancing one from a killing burn to a deep bruise. Dahl had pulled the vibration components from Veth scanning units and rigged them to lengths of wire strung across approach corridors. When a patrol entered range, the components hummed against the wire. Not loud, not reliable, but enough warning to set an ambush instead of stumbling into a fight. They were learning, and they were paying for every lesson. The group was smaller now. The worker who lost his arm in the first tunnel fight had died before dawn. Shock or blood loss or infection, they had no way to know, and no way to have changed it. One of the factory workers had taken a sidearm graze across the ribs during the warehouse fight. The wound was cauterized by the energy discharge, sealed shut in an instant, but something underneath was wrong. He breathed in shallow hitches and listed to one side when he walked. He did not complain. He did not slow down. But Tomas could see the color leaving his face by the hour, the gray creeping in like dusk. No medicine, no bandages worth the name, no antibiotics. A bottle of over-the-counter painkillers they had found in a foreman's desk, already half empty. Every fight they won cost something that did not come back. The Veth lost patrols. The humans lost people. The math was not the same. Tomas sat against a wall in the foundry and watched Dahl clean the bolt gun by the light of the kerosene lamp. The weapon had been designed to drive industrial fasteners into structural steel. It had never been meant to kill anything. It was the most effective weapon they had. "How much do we have left?" Tomas asked. Dahl checked the bolt magazine, held it up so Thomas could see. Not many. Not enough to keep doing what they had been doing. Torch. Elko checked the tank valve. One more fight. Maybe, if it is short. Tomas looked at the faces in the lamplight. Tired, hurt, steady. Not one of them had talked about stopping. Not one of them had asked what the point was. They had all seen the same thing in that first tunnel. The things that owned the sky could die in the dark. That was enough. That was the whole argument. "Then we stop chasing them," Tomas said. "We find ground that favors us. One approach. Maximum constraint. We make them come to us, and we use what we have left where it matters most." Dahl set the bolt gun down and nodded. The kind of nod that closed a conversation, because everything that needed saying had been said. Tovin received authorization to restructure patrol deployment. The processing time had been standard, fully within operational parameters, exactly as long as it always took. He doubled the patrol strength immediately. Larger teams, tighter formations, increased scanning frequency, overlapping coverage grids, continuous communication check-ins at fixed intervals. If any unit missed a single check-in, adjacent patrols would converge on their last known position. It was sound doctrine, textbook response to communication disruption in dense structural environments. The Ascendancy had refined these protocols across every world it had ever taken. The protocols worked because the protocols were correct. The first reinforced patrol entered the corridor's pipeworks district at standard pace. A full double-strength unit in tight formation, scanning instruments active, sidearms at ready position. They moved through the narrow corridors between the massive pipe arrays with the methodical confidence of personnel following established procedure. They were louder. Their combined bioluminescence filled the corridors with twice the light, casting moving shadows in every direction, turning every junction into a display that announced their position from 100 meters away. Their formation, designed for stability in open terrain, compressed in the tight industrial spaces until they were practically shoulder to shoulder. They could barely turn without knocking scanning instruments against pipe housings. They could not spread out. They could not maneuver. They were a single glowing mass in a space built for freight carts and maintenance workers. They swept the sector and reported it clear. The second reinforced patrol swept the northern warehouse block. Same result. Clear. No anomalies. They filed their report and moved to the next grid section. The third entered a rail maintenance tunnel and did not come out. When the check-in window passed without contact, Tovin dispatched the nearest patrol to their last known position. They found the tunnel empty. No bodies, no equipment, no personnel. Nothing except scoring on the concrete walls, the smell of scorched ozone, and drag marks on the floor leading to a service access point that opened into a maze of underground corridors, too narrow for a Veth to enter standing upright. Whoever was doing this had learned something from the reinforced patrols. Larger groups carried more equipment, more armor plating, more scanning components, more material that could be stripped from the dead and repurposed by hands that did not care what it had been designed for. The bigger patrols were not harder targets. They were richer ones. Tovin sat with the report on his display. The text glowed steady blue in the silence of the command note. He read it 3 times. The words did not change. Patrol after patrol. Gone. His system still showed no human electronic activity. Every metric on his display was green. The planet was compliant. The transition was proceeding within parameters. Yet his people were disappearing. He began composing his report to Regional Overseer Drennis. Standard format. Standard language. He wrote localized systemic interference and stopped. His fingers hovered above the console. The bioluminescent patterns on his arms were flickering in short, irregular bursts, a constant low-grade arrhythmia he could feel but could not suppress. It was the Veth equivalent of a racing pulse, of sweat on the palms, of the body knowing something the mind refused to name. He deleted the phrase, rewrote it, deleted it again. The Veth language was a precision instrument, hundreds of terms for systemic control, procedural hierarchy, regulatory function, and administrative process. It could describe the management of a civilization in exacting detail. Every concept the Ascendancy needed to operate across 13 conquered worlds had a word, a classification, a place in the lexicon. There was no word for what was happening in the corridor. The concept of an enemy with no structure, no communications, no weapons platform, and no central authority who could destroy patrol after patrol without triggering a single system alert did not exist anywhere in the Ascendancy's operational vocabulary. It was not a gap in the language, it was a gap in the imagination. The Veth had never needed a word for it, because they had never conceived that it was possible. Tovin wrote, "Unresolved personnel attrition in high-density structural environment," and sent the report. It was not what was happening, but it was all the language had room to hold. He requested authorization for heavy response assets, armored units, aerial support, breach and clear capability. The request entered the chain, regional overseer to tactical standards to fleet threshold, confirmation pending review, estimated processing time. Standard. Tovin closed the request file and stared at his display. Green. Everywhere green. A perfect system telling him a perfect lie. They almost killed each other in the pipeworks. Tomas and 3 of his group were moving through the western junction, a labyrinth of overhead conduits and floor-level valve housings that turned every corridor into a chest-high obstacle course. The darkness was total. They moved by touch, by memory, by the faint vibration of the rigged scanner wire that told them the nearest Veth patrol was far enough away to breathe. A shadow separated from the junction ahead. Something glinted in the dark. The whisper click of a crossbow being leveled. Tomas had the pry bar up. Behind him, Elko's hand was on the torch valve, ready to light. Silence. The kind that lasts forever, in the space between a trigger and a decision. "You are not tall enough," the shadow said. Tomas exhaled slowly. His grip on the pry bar did not loosen. "Neither are you." Fen Haltak lowered the crossbow. Behind him, Gross and the 2 brothers materialized from the pipe maze, like they had grown out of the metal itself. 4 shapes. Human. Armed with hand tools and the particular stillness of people who had already decided what they were prepared to do and had walked a long way to do it. No introductions. No handshakes. No names exchanged. Tomas looked at the crossbow, the hatchet on Fen's belt, the coil of steel wire, the nail gun in Mac's hands, the sledge across Gross's shoulders. "You found the drainage channel," Tomas said. "Your work?" "Ours." Fen nodded, a single dip of the chin that said everything a paragraph could not. They did not merge. They did not pick a leader. They did not sit down and draft a strategy. They stood in the dark at a junction of dead pipes and shared what mattered, where the patrols were running heaviest, which corridors were clear, how the Veth responded in close quarters, the freeze, the procedural stall, the fatal seconds of reaching for a system that could not save them, what the armor could stop, what it could not, how the scanning equipment worked and how it failed, how the biometric locks on the sidearms made every alien weapon useless to human hands. The exchange took minutes. Quick, efficient, no wasted words. 2 groups of strangers who had never met and would probably never meet again, standing in the dark, handing each other the tools to survive the next fight. Then Fen looked east, and Tomas looked west. "Good hunting," Fenn said. Stay off the main freight lanes, Tomas replied. They doubled coverage there. Bigger groups, louder, easier to spot but more dangerous if they pin you in the open. Fenn nodded once more. Then his group dissolved back into the pipeworks without a sound. Gone. 4 people who had walked in from the edge of the world with hand tools and the kind of resolve that did not announce itself, because it did not need to. Tomas watched the darkness where they had been. He did not know their names beyond the first exchange. He did not need to. The Veth had spent their entire history destroying command structures because that was how you defeated an organized enemy. Cut the head, and the body dies. There was no head to cut here, no body, just hands in the dark, working independently, guided by nothing but proximity and instinct and the shared understanding that the things walking their streets could be dragged down and killed with chains and fire if you chose the right ground. The Veth had shut down every system on the planet to prevent exactly this. They had shut down the wrong thing. Tovin's display updated. More gaps in the grid. More patrols that had checked in on schedule, entered a subsector, and never reported again. He stood at the console now. Could not sit. His patterns were flickering in constant, irregular cascades, racing across his skin in waves he could not control and could not hide. Any Veth who saw him would read the display instantly. Distress. Deep, systemic distress. The body broadcasting what the mind would not speak. His request for heavy assets was still in the authorization chain, moving through proper channels, being reviewed by the appropriate divisions, following the process that had never failed across every world the Ascendancy had ever taken. But something was killing his people in the dark spaces between the data points, something that did not register on any instrument the Ascendancy had ever built, something that fought without signals, without coordination, without weapons his systems could detect, without a structure his doctrine could target. Tovin stared at the display. He stared at the gaps. He listened to the silence pouring in from the corridor where trained Veth personnel walked into the dark and simply stopped existing. The system was working exactly as designed, and it was killing them. The report arrived on Kale Drennis's console like every other report that cycle. Standard format, standard classification headers, standard operational language carefully selected from the Ascendancy's approved lexicon. Drennis read it twice. Then he opened the files from the other sectors. Reports were filtering in from across the planetary surface, the same language appearing again and again, written by different sector commanders in different regions who had never communicated with each other, all reaching for the same inadequate words. Unresolved personnel attrition, localized systemic interference, communication disruption in dense structure environments. The same wording, told independently, across the entire world. Drennis pulled the global deployment map. The Ascendancy had committed a standard occupation force to this planet. Minimal. Distributed across major population centers and industrial zones. Sufficient for a species whose infrastructure had been completely neutralized. The doctrine was clear. Disable systems, wait for societal fragmentation, occupy at minimal cost. It had worked across every world the Ascendancy had ever taken. The force level was not an error. It was a calculation, refined across generations of successful conquest. The calculation had not accounted for what was happening. Gaps in the grid everywhere. Patrols gone silent on every continent. The same pattern. No command structure identified. The metrics were green across the board. Every system confirmed planetary compliance. Every sensor agreed. And the Ascendancy was bleeding out through holes in the data. Drennis authorized a full sector purge for the corridor. Armored units, aerial sensor platforms, concentrated force designed to sweep the industrial zone from end to end and neutralize whatever was hiding in its tunnels and factories and pipeworks. It was the correct response, the doctrinal response, the response the system prescribed, But Drennis sat at his console after sending the authorization and stared at the global map. The corridor was one zone, one sector, one small knot of industrial terrain on one continent of a planet with thousands of such zones. He had enough armored units to purge perhaps a handful of sectors simultaneously. Not all of them. Not even most. The Ascendancy had built its conquest model on the principle that a species without systems could not resist. That principle had allowed them to occupy worlds with minimal force, minimal cost, minimal risk. The principle was wrong, and there were not enough soldiers on this planet or in orbit above it to correct the error. At dawn, Fen Haltak found the supply point. It sat on the eastern edge of the corridor, where the industrial zone bled into a freight marshalling yard. Not a patrol, a fixed position. A cluster of prefabricated Veth structures arranged in a tight perimeter, housing equipment, replacement scanning units, and the logistical support that kept the patrols running. A small garrison staffed it, lightly armed. Not expecting contact. Why would they be? Every system told them the area was secure. Fen watched from the roof of a derelict switching station for a long time. He studied the layout, the approaches, the gaps between structures where the sightlines were broken, the single access point where supplies were moved in and out on low, flat transport platforms that glided without sound. Gross crouched beside him. The farrier's hands rested on the sledge handle with the easy familiarity of a man holding a tool he had used every day of his working life. "Tight," Gross said. "Not much room to move once we are inside. Not much room for them, either." Mac and Oren were below, rigging steel wire at knee-height across the access point. Quick, quiet work. The kind of thing men who built things for a living could do in the dark without speaking. They strung it tight between the support pylons of the nearest structure, low enough to miss a casual glance, high enough to catch a Veth mid-stride and send it sprawling. Fen loaded the crossbow. The bolts were heavy, designed for elk and black bear. They went in fast and close, the only way any of this worked. Fen put the first bolt through the neck of a Veth technician who was standing in the open between two structures, holding a piece of scanning equipment in both hands. The bolt punched through the gap between the collar plating and the shoulder joint, through whatever passed for a throat, and out the other side. The Veth dropped straight down like a puppet cut from its strings. No sound, except the clatter of the scanning unit hitting the ground. Then the wire caught the first responder, a garrison guard moving fast toward the sound of the fallen equipment, running with the long, loping stride of a species built for sustained speed. The wire took both legs out from under it at the shin. It went down face first into the hard-packed ground. Gross was on it before it could rise. The sledge came down once. The bioluminescent patterns flared in a wild burst and then went dark. But the garrison was not empty. More came out of the structures, armed, sidearms up, scanning the perimeter. Their patterns were flickering in rapid, chaotic bursts. They were afraid. Fen could see it on their skin, the fear written in light across their bodies in a language they could not hide. But afraid was not helpless. A sidearm blast caught Oren in the chest. The energy discharge was a flat, bright snap that lit the entire marshalling yard for a fraction of a second. Oren was thrown backward into the side of the switching station. He hit the wall and did not get up. The burn mark on his chest was the size of a dinner plate, edges perfectly cauterized, the flesh beneath it simply gone. Mac screamed his brother's name, just once. Then he went forward with the crowbar and did not stop, until there was nothing left standing in front of him. Fen put bolts into everything that moved. Throat gaps, joints, the spaces between armor sections where the plating met and did not quite seal. He learned the anatomy of the Veth in those minutes the way a hunter learns any animal. By where it breaks, Gross took a glancing sidearm hit across the hip. It spun him sideways. He caught himself on the sledge handle, used it like a crutch, and kept swinging. A Veth came at him from the left. He brought the sledge around in a low arc that caught it across the knee. It buckled. He hit it again on the way down. And again. And then his legs gave out, and he sat down heavily against a supply container with his hand pressed to his hip, where the fabric of his shirt had melted into the skin beneath it. "Go," he said to Fen. His voice was steady. His face was gray. "Finish it." Fen finished it. When the supply point was silent, Fen stood in the middle of the wreckage and counted what was left. Mac, on his knees beside his brother's body, hands shaking, crowbar still in his grip. Gross, sitting against the container, breathing in short, shallow pulls, the wound on his hip already turning colors that said the damage went deeper than skin. Fen looked at what they had taken. A Veth supply point, equipment, armor plating, scanning components, material that other hands in other parts of the corridor could strip and use and turn into weapons that the Ascendancy had never imagined their own technology becoming. This was what winning looked like when you had nothing to start with. It looked almost exactly like losing. The difference was that you were still standing, and the other side was not. Fen helped Gross to his feet. Mac would not leave his brother. Fen did not ask him to. He gripped Mac's shoulder once, hard, said nothing. There was nothing to say that the grip did not already carry. They moved what they could carry into the corridor's depths. Behind them, the supply point sat empty and gutted under a gray sky, and the Ascendancy's logistics chain in the eastern sector had a hole in it that no authorization protocol could fill. Tomas Bruckner chose his ground the way he had been taught, not the way the army taught it, with maps and overlays and satellite imagery, the way the millwright trade taught it, by knowing what a building could do, what it was made of, where it was strong and where it would give, where the heat went and where the air moved, and where a man could stand and where he could not. The foundry sub-basement was perfect. One access corridor, concrete walls thick enough to stop a sidearm blast, overhead catwalks made of steel grating, narrow enough that a single human could hold one against anything that tried to cross it. And at the far end, the blast furnace. Cold for years, massive, a cathedral of refractory brick and iron housing that still smelled of the thousands of tons of metal that had passed through its throat. Dahl had spent hours in the basement, studying the furnace, tracing the fuel lines, testing valves. The main gas supply was dead, like everything else. But the chemical stores on the plant floor above still held accelerants, industrial solvents, oxidizers, things that burned very hot and very fast and did not need electricity to ignite. "It will work once," Dahl said. He was rigging a manual ignition system from a striker and a length of fuel-soaked cord that ran from the catwalk to the furnace intake. One blast. I can flood the corridor with enough heat to cook anything in it, but the ignition point is here. He tapped the catwalk above the furnace mouth. There is no cover. Whoever lights it is standing in the open when it goes. Tomas looked at the catwalk, looked at Dahl. The old sergeant's face was calm, the same flat, steady calm he had carried since the first night in the foundry. The calm of a man who had already done the math and made his peace with the answer. "I will hold the catwalk," Dahl said. "You draw them in. Elko seals the corridor behind them. When they are committed, I light it." "Dahl." "The bolt gun is almost empty. The torch is spent. We have pipes and chains and whatever Veth plating Elko can strap to his arms." Dahl's voice was the same voice that had read patrol patterns on the first night. The parts list voice. "This is what we have. This is how it works." Tomas said nothing for a long time. There was nothing to say that would change the geometry of the situation. One corridor, one furnace, one catwalk, one man to light it, Make it count, Tomas said. That is the only thing I have ever done, Dahl said. They set the trap. Tomas left a trail, deliberate, obvious to anyone with scanning equipment. Pieces of Veth armor plating placed at intervals along the access routes leading to the foundry. Scorch marks from the welding torch on walls and doors, pointing inward. Drag marks on the floor. A breadcrumb path that said, "Something is in here. Something that has been killing your people. Come and find it." The Veth armored unit entered the corridor at midday, heavier than anything the humans had faced. Full tactical plating, reinforced helmets with integrated sensor arrays, weapons that hummed with a deeper, more resonant charge than the patrol sidearms. They moved in tight formation, sweeping every corridor, all junctions, any shadow. Professional, thorough, exactly what the Ascendancy sent when standard patrols were no longer sufficient. They found the trail within the hour. Tomas watched them from a ventilation grate on the floor above as they followed the breadcrumbs into the foundry, watched them stack on the access corridor entrance in a breach formation that was textbook clean, watched them move in, weapons up, sensors active, scanning for the electronic signatures and communication emissions that would tell them where the threat was. They found silence, cold concrete, dark corridors, the hum of nothing. They pushed deeper. Elko was waiting behind a barricade of scrap metal and dead machinery at the corridor's mouth. When the last armored Veth passed his position, he sealed the entrance. Steel plate welded to steel plate in the days before, held in place by chains and gravity, dropped into position with a sound like a vault door closing. Not permanent, not unbreakable, but enough to slow them down, enough to make them turn, enough to commit them to the corridor with no easy way out. The armored Veth reacted faster than the patrols, trained reflexes, combat protocols. They spun, weapons came up. The lead element fired at the sealed entrance, and the energy blast scorched the steel plate white hot, but did not breach it. Then Tomas hit them from the side. He came through a service hatch on the corridor wall with the pry bar and every remaining human behind him. Not a charge, a collapse. Bodies pouring into the corridor from a gap the armored Veth had not seen because it was not on their sensor overlay, because it was a maintenance access point built for factory workers, not a tactical entry point, because it was a hole in a wall that no system had ever mapped. Close quarters. The corridor was too narrow for the armored Veth to form a firing line. The ceiling was too low for them to stand at full height. The humans were inside their reach before the first weapon could track a target. Pry bars against helmet joints, chains around limbs. The last bolts from Dahl's gun fired point blank into the gaps between armor plates. The Veth fought back, hard. An armored fist caught Tomas across the shoulder and sent him into the wall. Something cracked. He felt it give. Felt the white-hot wire of pain shoot down his arm, and he swung the pry bar with the other hand, because stopping was not something his body knew how to do anymore. Another Veth grabbed one of the factory workers and threw him bodily into the far wall. The sound was bad. The worker did not get up. But the Veth were being pushed deeper, step by step, toward the furnace, toward the catwalk where Dahl stood in the dark with a striker in his hand and a fuel-soaked cord at his feet. Tomas saw the moment. The armored Veth were clustered at the corridor's deepest point, backs to the furnace, fighting forward, trying to push through the humans to reach the sealed exit. They were exactly where they needed to be. He looked up at the catwalk. Dahl was looking down. Their eyes met through the dark. Dahl nodded. "Back!" Tomas roared. The first word he had shouted in days. His voice broke on it. "Everybody back! Now!" The humans disengaged, scrambling, falling over each other, pulling the wounded, clawing back toward the service hatch with the desperate, graceless urgency of people who knew what was coming. Dahl struck the ignition. The cord caught. The flame raced along its length toward the furnace intake where the accelerants waited. Dahl stood on the catwalk and watched it go. The furnace spoke. A wall of heat erupted from the intake with a sound that was less an explosion than a roar, a deep, sustained, physical thing that shook the concrete and turned the air in the corridor into something that could not be breathed. The temperature spiked beyond anything the Veth sensors were calibrated for, their instruments overloaded, their helmet displays whited out. Their armor, designed for energy weapon deflection and kinetic impact, conducted the heat inward. The sound the Veth made was not screaming. It was higher than that. Oscillating. A frequency that belonged to a species that had never imagined dying like this. In the dark, underground, on a planet they had already conquered, killed by a furnace that a retired sergeant had lit with a piece of cord and a spark. Dahl was gone. The catwalk was gone. The heat took everything at that end of the corridor and made it equal. Concrete cracked, steel glowed. The refractory brick of the furnace housing held because that was what it was built to do, contain heat that would destroy anything else, and it did its job one final time. When the roar faded and the heat began to retreat, Tomas pulled himself through the service hatch and fell onto the factory floor. His shoulder was broken. His lungs felt seared. His hands were blistered. Elko came through behind him, upright, moving. The Veth armor plating strapped to his forearm was blackened and warped, but it had held. He carried the bolt gun in his other hand, Dahl's bolt gun. He had picked it up somewhere in the chaos, in the dark, in the moment between the retreat and the fire. He carried it now like it belonged to him, because it did. Behind them, the foundry sub-basement was a crematorium. Nothing was coming out of it. Not the armored unit. Not Dahl. Not the way any of them had been before they went in. Tomas sat on the factory floor and breathed. The air tasted like ash and ozone and the mineral smell of Veth that he would never be able to forget. His shoulders screamed. His hands shook. Around him, the survivors sat or lay where they had fallen, too spent to move, too alive to stop. He looked at Elko. The kid stood near the foundry door, silhouetted against the heat shimmer still rising from below. The fast food uniform was gone, replaced by a patchwork of scavenged Veth plating and factory clothing that looked like it had been assembled by someone who had learned to dress for war the way you learn any trade, by doing it until the mistakes stopped. Elko was not shaking. His eyes were not wide. He stood there the way Dahl had stood, the way Tomas had stood in that first tunnel. Still, steady, already looking for the next fight. Rael Tovin received the report and did not open it immediately. He already knew. He could feel it in the silence of the command node, in the absence of check-in signals, in the gaps that now covered his sector display, like wounds in a body that had stopped trying to heal. He opened the report. The armored unit was gone. Full tactical complement. The best equipped personnel the Ascendancy had deployed to this sector. Gone. In a basement. Killed by heat and metal and hands that held tools instead of weapons. He opened the global feed. Drennis had distributed a consolidated report across all sector commands. The language was still operational, still measured, still wrapped in the careful vocabulary of an empire that had never needed words for defeat. But the data was there for anyone who could read it. Every continent, every major deployment zone. The same pattern. Patrols vanishing. Supply points overrun. Armored units drawn into terrain that devoured their advantages and fed them to an enemy that had no shape, no signal, no structure, and no name. An enemy that materialized from the wreckage of its own civilization and fought with the pieces. The Ascendancy had conquered this planet in a single pulse, total systemic neutralization, the most efficient subjugation in recorded history. The metrics still confirmed it. The system still reported compliance. The display still glowed green. And across the surface of this compliant, neutralized, systematically defeated world, something was moving through the dark. Not an army, not a resistance, not an organization that could be mapped or targeted or negotiated with or destroyed. Just people, small groups, scattered, unconnected, armed with scrap and fire and the absolute refusal to stop. Tovin looked at his display. Green. Perfect. Compliant. He reached out and turned it off. The command node fell silent. Tovin stood in the absence of data and felt, for the first time in his career, what the humans had been living in since the pulse hit. A world without systems, without information, without the comforting architecture of control that told you what was real and what to do about it. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever experienced, and it lasted only a moment before he turned the display back on and resumed his duties. The humans had been living in it for days, and instead of collapsing, they had started killing. Elko walked out of the foundry into gray daylight. The corridor stretched before him, factories, rail yards, warehouses, pipeworks, a landscape of rust and concrete that had been dying for decades before the Veth arrived, and was now, in the strangest way, more alive than it had ever been. Smoke rose from the foundry basement behind him. Somewhere in the distance, a sound that might have been another fight, or might have been a building settling into its own collapse. The sky above held the faint, vast shape of something that still thought it owned this planet. Elko carried the bolt gun in one hand. The weight of it was familiar now. The Veth armor plating on his forearm caught the gray light and held it. He did not look back at the foundry. There was nothing behind him except the cost of what they had done, and the cost did not change whether you looked at it or not. He walked into the corridor. Somewhere ahead, there were more of them. There were always more of them. And somewhere in the dark, in the tunnels and the factories and the basements and the pipeworks, there were more of his kind too. People he had never met and never would. People fighting with whatever they had, wherever they were, for no reason more complicated than the fact that they were still alive and unwilling to stop being so. No orders, no plan, no system. Just the thing the Veth had not accounted for. The thing their sensors could not detect, and their doctrine could not categorize, and their language could not name. The part that fights anyway. It took the Ascendancy many days to realize they had not conquered Earth. It would take them much longer to understand why.